Welcome and hello, everybody, to the next podcast episode. I have with me today Kathleen Higgins. And Kathleen is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. She published widely in the field of continental philosophy, and especially about Friedrich Nietzsche and about aesthetics and music. And I was very happy that she was also my advisor at the University of Texas at Austin. And she's also one of the 12 founding advisory council members of our foundation. And so, hi, Kathleen, welcome. How
Hi,
are you today?
good to be with you.
Great. All right. Well, I'm very happy to have you here today. Very excited about our conversation. Today, we will talk about your recent book. It's called Aesthetics in Grief and Mourning, and it came out in 2024, so last year, very new. And it's quite an interesting, very deep topic. It's about grief and mourning, something that I think, I mean, everybody more or less experiences in his life, mostly to some extent. And then also the question of what mourning and grief is. And so that's something we can delve into today. But maybe before we do this, maybe we can talk a little bit about the book. This is the beautiful book, and it was a pleasure reading it.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
yes, very exciting to read it. And yeah, maybe we can talk about the book itself. And so it was published last year. Yeah, maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about why you wrote this book, kind of when you started it, or yeah, what is the history? What's the background of this book?
Well, obviously, grief is the background of the book. Um, my late husband, who is a philosophy professor himself, died suddenly when we were in transit in the Zurich airport many years ago now. And in that connection, I was at a loss. So orientation became very uh, foregrounded in terms of what I was thinking about, oftentimes, if not thinking about something much more immediate, like how to do something logistically. And one of the things that I was noticing, partly because Bob, my late husband, had been quite a popular teacher and a well-known philosopher, many people would get in touch with me. And just the aesthetic character of the way they were interacting with me. So, I mean, there's obvious things that many people experience when they're bereaved. Friends and family members send flowers, for example, which is certainly an aesthetic gesture. But also, I think that just the fact that people don't know how to talk or what to say or do in the context of relating to somebody who's bereaved means that a lot of the behavior is much more gestural. And I don't think that makes it inferior communication. I think it's just a very interesting fact that that is one of the ways that we communicate, especially in contexts where things seem particularly important to us. I mean, it isn't just a matter of talking about how you navigate, probate court or whatever it is, but it's much more people are trying to communicate about their feelings and convey their support, and especially without any clarity about what the bereaved person maybe believes or how they're feeling. This becomes a much more complicated project than many ordinary communicative interactions. Another thing that I noticed was thinking back, at one point I had been asked to be a commentator for philosopher and art critic Arthur Danto in a presentation that he made here at the University of Texas on the nature of beauty and especially the lack of beauty in a lot of modern art. And one of the things that he talked about in connection with some modern works that he thought are beautiful is that they were elegies. And he was pointing out that it was very interesting to him that beauty somehow seems an appropriate response to loss and to grief, even though that wasn't something that he went into. But the fact that he had brought that up, I think, maybe primed me for thinking about this more thoroughly.
Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. And also, I'm sorry for your loss if that's
Thank you.
appropriate to say. That's interesting what you say about the how beauty is connected with it, as Danto talks about, and this notion of there's this desire to create something somehow when there is loss or when there's bereavement.
Hmm.
Is that a bit a kind of what you were curious about in a sense of why do we produce art, right? Why do we produce
Yeah.
aesthetic things and aesthetic gestures in terms of in moments of loss, of in moments of just strong emotions, perhaps also.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a combination of a desire for expression and also a desire to be, in some ways, not just a passive, hapless victim of what happens. Because I think that when someone that you love dies, there's often a sense of you're just being on the receiving end of whatever caprices of the universe happen to happen. And just the idea of being able to do something that is coming from you and you're not just the recipient of what might feel like chaos all around you, I think is really very healing in these contexts.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, is there which seems to me also one of the guiding thoughts of your book, right? That you kind of you talk about why are aesthetic practices so helpful, and what do they do in this engagement? And there's something empowering about this, right? And so
Hmm.
instead of just sitting back and not doing anything, it seems if you engage with art you do something, right? And I think how you phrase it, you're honoring the living and the dead, or you're honoring the dead while also being open to the living.
Yes, of course, it depends on what it is you're doing. But yes, I do think one of the things that a lot of different kinds of engagements with the arts and other aesthetic practices, which can be more informal, one of the things that they can do is connect you with the dead in the sense that you might be continuing a kind of love that someone had for a certain kind of music, say. And there's a sense in which you still, in some sense, share music that you love with the dead, even though they're not necessarily in the room listening with you. But the fact that there's a kind of continuity between the living and the dead, I think, becomes much more obvious in connection with some of the arts, or for that matter, just engaging with artistic traditions. We enjoy lots of artworks that were produced or created by people who are no longer with us. And I don't, feel that I do feel that it is a connection, for instance, with Bach when I listen to Bach's music, even though Bach has been dead for centuries. And that sense of continuity among the generations, I think, is something that is very reassuring in these contexts. So that's definitely a part of it.
And that's a fascinating topic. I think we should explore this notion of mourning, of how we deal with the dead more generally. Maybe before we go there, one thing I did notice in your book and also in the essay that you wrote for our website is what I would call a certain phenomenology of
Mm,
bereavement, which you explicitly call it this, right? A phenomenology of
mhm.
bereavement in a phenomenology of grief, which I found very fascinating. I don't know if anybody has done this before, but it's very much all these different nuances and aspects that are involved in this. And it seems that you're also making use of the philosophy of orientation. And it seems that what we're encountering in moments of bereavement is basically it's a new situation in a way, right? We
Mhm.
orient ourselves in a new situation where where some routines break away, or maybe even I think how you phrase it that all the routines, all these so many different routines and orientation worlds that we trusted in and that are familiar to us are no longer familiar, right? And so there's
Yes.
something about how everything we trusted is no longer there, right? And there's about everything is breaking away. And so I found it, I mean, also very like it helped me to understand and to connect it and to see, how to experience this in a certain way. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this phenomenology, or maybe also how the
Hmm.
philosophy of orientation maybe is helpful maybe to explain those aspects.
Right. Well, first, I'm certainly not unique in writing about the phenomenology of grief. In some ways, C.S. Lewis was writing about the phenomenology of grief in his grief memoir, A Grief Observed. And more recently, Thomas Fuchs and Matthew Radcliffe have written quite a lot about phenomenological experiences during grief. I mean, just to say, phenomenology here is not necessarily to invoke a particular tradition in philosophy, but to talk more about just what are the characteristics of how you feel and how you relate to the world while grieving. And one of the things that is certainly thinking philosophically that I've found very fascinating is that almost everything seems transformed in the context of grieving. So it isn't just, like obviously the person who's died is no longer in your immediate environment, but the way you relate to everybody else suddenly seems very different just as a consequence of that, or the sense of normal interaction that most people carry around with them. I mean, I don't think we are even attuned to how much we're kind of presupposing a lot of things in common when we interact with people. We kind of expect certain patterns in the world to just kind of continue as they're going. And all these things that are so background and basic to interaction get thrown into disarray when you're grieving. I remember at one point having a number of different friends over at the house shortly after Bob died, and they were talking about, like what was going on next week. And I just thought, they don't know how fragile this all is. Because, of course, to operate in the world, you're not going to be in better shape for doing that if you're focusing on how fragile things are and how things could fall apart. But the fact that sometimes they do fall apart is something that I think maybe we should be a little bit more aware of in ordinary life. But in the same way, it's not something that one can easily relate to other people, assuming. So the big challenge that I emphasize a lot in the book is how a bereaved person comes to reintegrate with the social world, because the social world is kind of moving along with, certain patterns and assumptions and practices and routines that are going along fairly consistently. And the bereaved person suddenly feels thrown out of that. And how to reintegrate that in a way that doesn't itself create more problems, I think is really the challenge. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's useful to focus on aesthetic practices, because so many of them involve, as part of what's going on, relating to other people and communicating without necessarily the assumption that everybody is sharing views or assumptions about absolutely everything. And that connects with orientation too, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like how you put it, the fragility of even the next moment, in a sense, right?
Hmm.
That's also something which I would say the philosophy of orientation also emphasizes the singularity of every moment, right? That every moment
Hmm.
is singular eventually, and everything that holds are our routines, right? And we hold on to them. And these routines could also be our routines of engaging with other people, right? Our routines of communicating, our routines of, yeah, emotions even, and our physical routines. You speak about the
Hmm.
intercorporeality with somebody else. And also I like how you talk about the I guess just meaning, right? And it reminded me of when Heidegger speaks about the world as something, it's something that's not just, it's not a thing that we just look at and walk around in, but it's something that's always already meaningful, right? And so
Yeah.
if the world that we live in, and if we inhabit it with a partner, Um, or yeah, in any situation where grief then appears, it's that how these layers of meaning are so deeply engaged in who we are, in our in our routines and what we do, and what we understand, what makes a meaningful life even, right? And so
Hmm.
in a sense of what is, I mean, orientation is also about finding meaning, right? It's about meaningful, like finding meaning means you orient yourself in terms of meaning. And so that's also then breaking away in those situations.
Yes, I mean, I think that those situations, in fact, make us aware of how much our sense of the meaning of all kinds of things that we do and even objects around us are bound up with our experience of sharing with other people. And when you notice that someone with whom you've shared a lot is no longer there in the physical world, the kinds of things that you notice standing out, things that belong to the person stand out in a really strange way. I mean, it's like they have a little aura attached to them, which in ordinary life, while a person is alive, you might associate them with a person in a way, but it's not something that you really pay that much attention to. But just the way in which everything stands out somewhat differently in these contexts, I think can make us aware just how fundamentally interactive our conception of our world is. And maybe that makes it easier to notice what we share with other people as well as the way our particular way of viewing things at a given time might be rather singular, in part because of our various relationships with people who are present and people who no longer are.
Yeah, I remember this passage in your book where you say, what's the point of being funny if you can't tell your mom, right?
That's right.
And I can definitely relate to, there's just certain people you want to share something with, right? And even if, yeah, even in a relationship, let's say that ends, for example, right? Or, but all kinds of those situations, I can relate where and then you can't share this anymore, but it's something which shows, yeah, there's this desire, right? And so I was listening to a podcast by Andrew Huberman who talks about grief.
Hmm.
And he says, for example, the difference between depression and grief is that in grief, you have this motivational state that you want to do something, but you can't.
Hmm.
It's this frustration. That is also why you have in these stages that you also address, these five stages by Kübler-Ross, right, where you have the stage of anger, for example, which you don't have in depression as much, because there's still this desire of reaching out, but which is frustrated.
Yeah, although I would say that maybe in depression you do have anger. It's just anger at yourself for, like whatever wherewithal you think you would need to be able to relate to the world in happier terms. And on the five stages, I mean, I think, if only to defend Kubler-Ross, she did not claim that there are five stages of grief that operate in a sequence. She claimed that initially, when dealing with patients who had terminal conditions and were facing imminent death, that these are five reactions, and sometimes one gives way to another. And she also thought you saw parallels with people who are grieving. And that's all well and good, but I think that sometimes we have a sense that, there's a schedule or these are kind of markers of how well you're doing. And I think that that is very far from the case and really kind of counterproductive for healing.
And you addressed this also. I found it interesting. This question of when Freud, for example, he talks about that there's the goal of grief work, of Trauerarbeit, is to relinquish the attachment, right, in order to then
Yes.
go on, and which you're critical of this notion. And so I wonder then, yeah, what's the alternative in that sense?
I mean, I suppose I mean, whether or not I'm fair to Freud, I don't know because it's hard to know precisely how circumscribed his sense of relinquishing attachment is. I mean, it's basically, in his sense, libido or, kind of psychic sexual energy needs to be detached from in his view, an object that's no longer present in the world. I think I would quarrel with that, actually. I do think that it's quite possible to direct libidinal energy toward people who are not present in the world. For that matter, people have all kinds of attachments to people they don't know, such as musical performers that they've never encountered personally. So I don't think that this is as straightforward as Freud means it, but he might be talking mainly about the fact that it's just really hard to assimilate the fact that the person isn't coming home or, like isn't, just away, and that you're not really going to see the person in physical form again, and that it is a kind of gradual thing that we get used to. And so I guess again, it depends on what attachment means. We may have more views about what goes into that than he had fully articulated. But insofar as he thinks that the goal of grief is to get rid of these attachments, um, I think that that is not entirely what goes on or should go on, really.
So this notion of different attachments, I think that's also one place where the philosophy of orientation can be helpful again to think about it in
Mm.
terms of different routines, right? That we have different routines and some of them continue and others will not. And also to see, basically to see, love as a routine, emotions as a routine, thought patterns as a routine, even then memories. But of course, many of them you can't control in that sense, right? I found interesting how you talk about this, how these memories then just come up all the time,
Hmm.
right? And it also did kind of disorients you in your temporal awareness of things. But yeah, I think that it could be helpful. I think with to use this terminology here.
Yeah, I do think that the nature of memory in this connection, I mean, in some ways it's atemporal, and that is probably characteristic of the way we relate to the dead as well. I mean, it's not that we have this kind of linear view of our connection with a person, and like now we're in this phase, but memory is all over the place. Like I might remember something hilarious that Bob and I shared, many years before he died. And that can actually be something that is sustaining in the context of grief, not just a mistake as the way Freud describes things might lead you to expect.
Yeah, there's also, I think it is, was it Nico Frida talks about this notion of what are the tentacles of love. I like this quote that you have, the tentacles of love don't just stop, right? They just continue,
Yes,
like they continue reaching out for their after,
yes.
how love may continue also after death.
Yes, and in the context, he was largely focused on Commemoration Day in um, the Netherlands, having to do with people who had died in the Second World War. So these are not recent deaths that he's talking about, but like decades later, talking about how it's important to continue to value the connection that you still have with people who have died.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we should probably talk about the connection of love and grief. But maybe before we go there, I wanted to talk about this notion of mourning and mourning how
Mm,
it relates to the human being as such. There's some research,
mm,
of course, which talks about that some animals also mourn, right? Like elephants famously,
hmm
right? But also some even bury the dead in some way. Was it ants or some insects? And so that some animals do the same. But then there is this notion, or there's this argument, I think Jonathan Lear talks about this, that mourning is constitutive for the human being,
hmm
constitutes who the human being is. And I'm curious about that, what that means, and what your thoughts about this are. So in a sense of how does mourning define the human being as such?
Well, I think because human beings necessarily have some temporal sense of things, it's possible to have a conception of a loved one's death means the person isn't coming back in physical form. Um, and so extrapolating into the future, there's a kind of finality to it that perhaps some animals have, but it isn't clear to me that we get very far speculating about what their perception of time is or their sense of what the significance is of someone in, I mean, I guess these are usually social animals that we perceive these kinds of behaviors with. If someone in their group dies, it's very hard to know quite how they're internalizing this. Nevertheless, they obviously see it as called for to engage in certain kind of behaviors that we associate with mourning. But for us, there is a sense of continuing into the future and what to make of that, given the absence of someone who has been so bound up with your life as you've known it, at least for some long period. And what does that mean? So that's one aspect of mourning. I think there's also a sense of ethical obligation, I think, is a bit strong, but a sense of responsiveness to other human beings. And I don't think that just because someone dies, we have a sense that we no longer have any responsibilities toward them. But the form that that would have to take in terms of how we would carry those out is going to be radically different than in the case of someone who is present. And that too is something that I think we feel the need to do something about. I think often there's a very strong sense that something needs to be done on behalf of the person or to honor the person and almost immediately. And that's why in the book I talk a lot about ritual, because I think the fact that our traditions in the human world often involve clear rituals to engage in after someone dies is something that we ought to be so grateful for because it gives us something specific to do, especially in contexts, as we mentioned before, where you feel like you should do something, but you have no idea what.
Derrida also talks about this, right, of
Mhm.
mourning in his late work, especially the work of mourning. And that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of how it's constitutive also of the human being, as we
Hmm.
are basically living in a world that was created by those who are dead now, in a sense, right? And so
Yeah.
we're living in the presence of those who are absent in that sense.
Yes.
It reminds me of Heidegger, right? Talks about this thrownness. We're thrown into a culture, into a language that we haven't created, right? And so we're dwelling in it. And so we're dwelling in a world, yeah, that has been created by those who are dead now. And so and I guess with Derrida, he talks about this in the context of the friend, right? Of how can we do justice to the friend
Mm-hmm.
of those we have loved, and that we can't really do justice eventually. Like we have to, in a sense, right? We have to try to. We always already do in
Hmm.
some way. We relate to them in some way, and
Hmm.
we can only try to be as just as we can towards them, right? But it's this continual engagement with them, and that's I think how I understand as the process of mourning is this continual engagement with the other who we had a relationship with, and we still do when he or she is gone.
Hmm.
So
And yeah, initially when I was thinking about this, I was thinking more in terms that are suggested by the way Derrida talks, that you can only fail at this, but you know, you still need to do it. And I think that might be making it a little bit more negative a project than it actually is. I remember one of the most affecting, transformative conversations I had after Bob died was with a friend. I mean, I was saying that I felt like I had somehow let him down because I hadn't done this or that, and it might have prevented the death and so on. And he said, I think you're just talking about love. You can never do enough for someone you love, but if you want to be guilty about it, go ahead. But that's not really, so productive. You're just talking about the fact that there's no end to love or what love might motivate you to do on behalf of the other person. But that can be viewed much more positively than just structurally an incapacity on our part.
That is something I'm also curious about, and I like also you bring up Joyce, The Dead, the short story about
Oh, yes.
what's her name? Gabrielle Conroy's wife, Greta. I think Greta Conroy.
Hmm.
How she's yeah had been in love when she was young, and he's thinking about that she had never felt this love ever afterwards again. And so, but there's something I found interesting is this relation, as you talk about, this relation between love and grief, right? And so
Mm,
there seems to be the more you love, the more you grieve. But I also wonder, I mean, is then what is love? Like, what are the if we talk about it philosophically, right? So
right.
in sense of what do we maybe even in terms of orientation for what do we do when we love, right? And how is there maybe a structural similarity to grief, right? And so there's this. It seems to be like the tentacles of love reaching out, but
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about love philosophically, but one of them certainly has to do with the way that a relationship is infused in your whole way of relating to the world and relating to yourself. So, in connection with a partner, for example, it's going to be quite obvious that you have often done things with the person, and many of your habits are presupposing the other person, even making plans to go somewhere, reference to the person, whether the person was going to go or not, is always a part of the way you're doing things. Um, Bob, who used to theorize a lot about this, thought that love, at least romantic love, had to do with, in some sense, your own sense of identity being bound up with the other person, so that you make yourself in relationship to the other person, and that does make it complicated when you consider what happens when that person dies, because whatever sense you have of yourself in relation to the other person, all of those aspects of yourself are going to have to undergo a lot of modification to go forward. And I don't think that necessarily means that we relinquish our bonds with the other person. I think that is not really what typically happens in contexts where people love each other. But nevertheless, how that is expressed in ordinary life is going to undergo quite a bit of change. And that, I think, is part of the creative project in some ways that is involved in grief work. I think the idea that grief work is about how to do without, you know, the presence of someone who is pivotal in your life really does focus on the loss and prolong the sense of loss as characteristic of your life as a whole. But thinking about how to relate to the person going forward can be much more, well, at least not as negative as all that. It has a kind of positive aspect too, because there is still the continuation of love, and that has practical impacts on the way you do things in your life. And also, I think it does sustain a kind of connection with the person, if only because you're taking the person into account and presumably trying to take them into account in a way that allows a recognition socially of the person's having been here and played an important role in life.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I wonder though in the sense, so it's about being part of the other. It's a partnership in a sense, right? So it's a
Hmm.
shared identity. It's a sharing of experiences. I mean, is there? But I wonder if how is it then different from, let's say, close friendship, for example?
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, I think that, yeah, focusing on the partnership of two people who are in love with each other and build a life together makes it, in some ways, too clear a case. I think it's obviously much more complicated than that. And there are lots of ways in which these various kinds of relationships that are important in one's life have similar patterns, but exactly what one would do, to honor a friend that died. Maybe the friend is someone that you saw regularly, maybe not. I think that that too is something that aesthetics can help us somehow integrate into our way of looking forward and in some sense carrying on something of that person's way of dealing with the world. Um, I mean, it's in some ways we're the legacy of our friends who die too, because we are keeping some of their way of being in the world alive in a larger social context. And how that works out in different relationships, I think, is often going to be very specific. But I do think that there's a kind of similarity to what's involved when a family member that you live with dies, or a spouse or partner.
Yeah, and it seems to me there's also this a past version of oneself that is lost, right? And that is something there's and you quote this in your essay also this from Stigma, this the orientation worlds that you've shared with somebody will be gone forever, right? And so
Hmm.
there's this notion of this, yeah, it was something beautiful, something enjoyable, something where you were alive, where you felt alive. And there's this notion of, yeah, this certain singularity of experience also, which will forever be gone, right? And there's something that's deeply sad about that, right? And
Oh,
it's,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, trying to say that there could be some things that we can view as not, like totally depressingly negative doesn't mean I don't think it's all terribly sad. Of course, it's sad. But I think that um, there's something positive to be done in relation to the relationship and the other person in trying to work through ways that we continue to carry on something having to do with their way of being in the world as we go forward.
yeah, maybe we can talk about this notion of aesthetic practices, as you have mentioned multiple
Mm.
times, and
Hmm.
how that relates to grief, to mourning, but also to the human being again, right? And so
Hmm.
this notion of, I think, here I have a quote from you, I think it's from your conclusion. You say, aesthetic activity is central to what it is to be human,
Hmm.
right? And so I found that interesting, again, maybe in distinction from animals also. But yeah, maybe what are your, how are we artistic human beings? How is the human being artistic, creative, aesthetic?
Well, aesthetic is, as I argue, a very broad term. So, yeah, there's straightforward artistic media that people work in and convey meanings that are subject to interpretation and dispute. But there are a lot of things that we do in everyday life that are also aesthetic, in my view. I mean, aesthetics was initially a study of what is perceived through the senses, or um, the nature of the kind of knowledge that we get in sensory terms. And art became a focus, partly because art clearly involves media that are sensory in some sense and different ways of conveying meaning through them. But I think just in general, how we relate to the world in terms of our senses and finding meaning, while that might be too broad as a definition for aesthetics, certainly covers a lot of area that I would say is aesthetic in kind of a straightforward sense. I mean, the very fact that we have styles of doing things, style is often viewed as characteristically aesthetic, and I think that it is. The way in which we gesture or use tone of voice to convey meanings to other people. It's very hard to pinpoint that with any precision. And I think that is often characteristic of the aesthetic, that it conveys possibilities for interpretation that are not completely constrained. And so, in the language of orientation, offer more leeways for further development or ways of going forward. And I think this actually is characteristic of a lot of phenomena that could be viewed as aesthetic. I mean, the way someone arranges things in their house or their room is aesthetic, and one can draw different conclusions about the person, maybe from the stylistic things that one sees in that. One can interact over these stylistic things. There can be collisions of styles. I think all of these things are part of what's aesthetic. And the thing that I think is especially important for what it is to be a human being is that constantly we're interacting with other people whose takes on things are somewhat different from our own, or perhaps radically different from our own. And yet there's a sense in which we're sharing a world that we perceive through the senses, which we more or less function similarly among us, and how to make sense of or find meaning in and share meanings in connection with that radically individuated way of relating to the world, I think is just basic to what it's like to have a society and interact with other people and share experiences. So, in that sense, I think that's really very fundamental. But also, one of the things that I point to toward the end of the book is that a lot of the way that we show respect and concern for other people is conveyed more through aesthetic gestural means than it is through straightforward statement. So, without the whole range of possibilities that aesthetic gestures and behaviors make possible, we'd have a much reduced set of possibilities for relating to each other and building social units.
In terms of, I mean, different styles, and I guess we could say that animals might also have different. If you think of birds, for
They certainly do.
right? Birds, for example, but especially obviously cats and dogs, so the animals that are closer to us. But yeah, there seems to be a lot of aesthetic behavior in that sense also among animals.
I guess we don't necessarily, I mean, again, I'm always hesitant to guess what the experience of an animal is like internally, but at least we know that we have reflective possibilities. So we can not only exhibit style, but think about our style. And other people relate to our style and think about it and criticize it. And we can deliberately alter our styles. Those things I think are distinctively or characteristically human, even if it's conceivable that some other animals may. I mean, I have no idea how whales relate to their world, which from a sensory point of view must be quite different from ours. But on the other hand, their intelligence seems to share quite a lot with ours too. And they sing in many cases. So hard to say.
If we think about then art itself, so artworks, which
Hmm.
it might be harder to say if animals. I mean, there's some that do tools and so on, right? But I guess what makes the human being unique could be this yeah, the that we produce art which lasts for a long time, right? That we create literature which then we pass on over generation over generation over generation. We build buildings, we build things, yeah, that just last for a long, long time, where we can then all orient ourselves to, and where we can find ourselves in. Where we, I mean, if you think about the myths, for example, they all give us stories, right? The narratives that we can orient ourselves to, in a sense.
Hmm.
And so it seems that this is something which might make the human being unique in some sense.
Yeah. And Jonathan Lear would say that all of that is part of mourning in one sense, because it is honoring and missing and keeping alive certain possibilities that were bequeathed to us from people who've died.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I liked also this relation, right? As we talked about in the beginning, this of that we tend to create something when we're mourning, but also when we're in strong emotions. Then, if we think about the ancient Greek tragedies, for example, right, which were, we could say, they were communal ways of mourning.
Mhm.
They were communal ways of yeah, dealing with death, right? I mean, it was about the tragedies, so there was it was yeah, and at a time when there was not really much other media, right? It wasn't like they could
Mhm.
be at home and so on, right? But it was
Right.
basically dealing with the fact of loss, of mourning, of death, of change, and so on. Um, that seems to be like a strong example of what that culture, how they dealt with it. And we actually just had a seminar about it. It was about Dionysus and Shiva, and then
Mm.
how basically, there's a lot of similarities between the two gods, but that also the Greek theater was on behalf of Dionysus, right? And Dionysus is the god that brings change and transformation. It seems to me that there's a way. It's yeah, it's an offering in a sense for those who are mourning, maybe to deal with it, right? Or what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly if one were to read Nietzsche on this topic, he certainly seems to think that Greek tragedies were a way that collectively the Athenians came to grips with human vulnerability and also gained a sense of being connected to the immortality of nature, which is also a way of dealing with the inevitability of death of the individual. And although there it seems that you could view it as a sense of your own vulnerability being addressed, there's also a sense of that pertaining to everybody else as well. Whether or not the myths directly address loss or just the eventual loss of oneself, that I'm not so sure, but I think it would be kind of hard to separate reflections on one from reflections on the other when actually one's thinking about living in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me there's this like a collective healing almost, or that's one way to
Mm, yes.
basically. I mean, I imagine that, there's a lot of traumatized people who have lost people left and right, and then that's one way to deal with it, right? It's this kind of collective, and there's collective weeping, and there's, just very emotional. And when he talks about catharsis, that's a way of, how it makes
Mhm.
sense to me. You go there and then you cleanse yourself in a sense in order to move on afterwards.
Yes, right, right. I mean, I guess the difference between Greek tragedy, which is collective and very general, and rituals that we have in connection with a particular person's death. I mean, it seems they have some things in common. The generality of the Greek focus, I think, would certainly pertain to how they thought about loss in connection with individuals, but that isn't necessarily what the plays themselves were so focused on, although some of them do. I mean, in some of them, the plot involves what do people do after the death of a father, especially a father who's been murdered, and how to respond to that. In the case of funereal rituals, I think there's also a kind of collective coming together, and that too is collective, but it also has a much more individuated aspect, just in that it usually is a funeral for a particular person. Like, occasionally, a number of people have died, and there is a kind of collective memorial for them. But sometimes I think that individual focus brings into focus some of the things we've been talking about especially well. And it also connects people who themselves have varying relationships with the person who's died, or maybe no direct relationship at all, but they've come out of sympathy for people who are experiencing the loss more immediately. So I think that it also has a collective function, but a very different one.
Yeah, for sure. I also, I mean, I like how you talk about the different art forms that are relevant here as well, right? There's music,
Mm.
which touches you. I think you talk about like it's a strong embrace. There's the storytelling, right, and the narratives, which is also interesting in terms of myths, but then also
Mhm.
your own storytelling, which I think you say it's the function is or what it does. It helps you ordering things and it gives
Mhm.
you agency as well.
Right. Well, another thing that I think is especially useful about artistic projects is they're not, like projects that you start, you do certain things and you're done. I think art in general is available to help us think and rethink. So in that sense, it has a special kind of relationship to orientation and reorientation, because even if an artist decides that the artwork is finished, there's a kind of ongoing life for it, and potential for all kinds of interpretations and reinterpretations and discussions of interpretations. But that can motivate further artworks, or it can motivate further thinking along these lines that themselves feed other creative projects. So I think that as human beings, our need to communicate and also express ourselves in ways that have personal meaningfulness, not just a matter of fitting ourselves into pre-established ways of doing things, but the personal meaning is really, I think, pretty vital to us. And that's something that is an ongoing aspect of our lives. So that's yet another way in which I think aesthetics is pretty basic to human experience.
It's as you said it. I mean, it in a way it enriches us, right? And I think that's how stigma thinks of it. Aesthetic practices or generally artistic ways. I mean, especially if we think about literature, for example,
Mm.
how it offers, and you talk about is it offers you unfamiliar territory that you have to orient yourself in, right? Or
Hmm.
it offers you examples of how other people have oriented themselves in similar situations, right? And so it enriches you by stories, basically, that can be helpful, that can give you a map, right? It can give you, yeah, like an example of how you can deal with those situations.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. And also, I mean, just thinking about maps in general, it depends on where you are at the moment and what you're trying to do, how you relate to them. So even though literary stories that are set down in words, you might say in one sense are fixed, in another sense are not fixed at all, because we can keep referring to them and reconsidering what was going on or some aspect of the way characters behave. And I think that that is one of the maybe ethical functions of literature in human life.
Yeah, for sure. And then I'm also curious then in terms, and I like what you said, and to reinterpret it, to read it in different ways, that to what extent is this maybe also then important for going through grief is to change the story
Mm.
because there's I'm sure the story probably changes in that course of events and that there's this ability, yeah, to reinterpret it.
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I suppose it depends a lot on what context, the context of a particular relationship and how one knew a person. Though, I mean, maybe that is maybe saying it too strongly. It does seem to me that often it's possible to recall what someone who has now died said and see it in a new light. Like, things that my mother said, for example, in one context, I interpreted one way, but now that I've reached ages that my mother was in, perhaps when she said the thing, I can see that in a new light because I think, oh, she's drawing on a different kind of life experience than I had when I was 20, say, or 15. And I think that there's something comparable in recollections of a lot of people and things that they've said and ways that they responded to things. Or you encounter an experience that somehow resembles in your own mind something that a friend who's died experienced. And even though you might feel a little frustration that you can't discuss it with the person, you might also feel a kind of guidance or input from what you remember of the way the person dealt with or thought about these things at the time. So I do think that there's a kind of ongoing character to the interaction, even though obviously the person isn't immediately present to talk with.
Yeah, there's this the connection as we talked about between art, artistic creation, and grief or strong emotions. So Tony Robbins says that basically after these stages of grief, ideally you add another stage, and that's new creation.
Hmm.
And so, but the idea or the question would then be, would this be the most empowering way to deal with grief and mourning? Would it be to create something which is based on the strong emotion to do something with it in a sense, right? And so, yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if I think that there are generalities to be made here. And again, because I'm skeptical of stages, I'm skeptical of a sixth stage, but I do think that there's something creative going on throughout one's efforts to deal with loss. I do think that there are probably people that get somehow fixated and have great difficulty doing anything in the face of loss. But it may well be that such people need therapeutic help or maybe not formal therapeutic help, but help from other people. But still, I think that just trying to figure out how to relate to the world in a new context is itself extremely creative. Um, Thomas Addig, who has written a lot about grief, calls the process that people engage in relearning the world. And he sees this as a kind of relearning that involves a kind of development of love and separation. That this is you could call it a stage of love, I suppose, but there's a sense in which there's definitely a relationship that continues, but it's a relationship in which the love acknowledges and is aware of the separation and yet is still um, informed by the role the person has played in life and continues to play in one's own life going forward.
yeah. In when so when you wrote this book, and I don't know how long it took, but would you say that your view of how one, let's say, best orient oneself in to go through grief has changed in some way when you wrote it, or
Well, I suppose, I mean, early on, as I mentioned, I was thinking particularly of the fact that in one sense, you can't do enough. I mean, it's hard to do anything or feel like you're doing anything on behalf of a person who's died, even though you feel compelled to. So I was more focused on that initially and thinking that, in fact, this probably can continue to motivate other creative activities because it's something that can never be completed. I mean, I guess I still think that, but I wouldn't really focus on that at this point. I'd more focus on the way that creativity and creative responses, and responses that, in some sense, are expressive or gestural, are ongoing, and in fact, are means of sustaining the relationship, but allowing it to evolve into a form that is possible under the new circumstances. So that would be a way in which I think my thoughts about it have changed. Probably there are others too, but to me, that's the most dramatic.
How long did you work on this book? Just curious.
Well, that's very hard to say. I mean, as a book, I guess about 10 years in that I had in mind some book to write and wrote some parts of it. Um, and there were always other projects. I found this one especially challenging to organize in part because I thought just to make the case that there are a lot of aesthetic features that kick in when someone is contending with loss might not be evident. So it, part of what I wanted to argue is that if you start looking around, there are actually aesthetic phenomena going on all over the place. I mean, just the very way that people organize funerals or, um, as I mentioned, like behave in matters of etiquette in these connections are extremely aesthetic. But to avoid just having, here's a bunch of things like a list, I think that's a very bad way to organize most of the time. Having a list of aesthetic activities and behaviors and practices struck me as not the way to go. And so, that being a big formal problem, I'd write, some analyses of different things. But yeah, I guess the shape of the book was actually the hardest part.
Yeah, I can see that, but I think it was very clear, so I
Oh,
appreciated the
great.
clarity. Yeah. And also, I mean, I could see though, or I can see why it was difficult, just because of this wide range of, I mean, first what you encounter and what you do and the phenomenology of it and all the different practices and the different art forms and so on. So it's a vast field. And maybe to we can slowly come to the end, but I would ask you what would be your advice for somebody who goes through a difficult and complicated grief? Is there something that you would like to share?
I guess just the thought that it isn't a kind of betrayal of the person to go forward, and that it isn't necessary to completely leave the person behind to do so. And that I think various kinds of aesthetic practices can help facilitate a sense of continuing something valuable about the relationship um, at the same time as acknowledging the loss and the sadness of the loss and the role the person has played in your life while alive.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. You briefly actually touch on chatbots as well in your book.
Oh, yes,
So there's
right.
of course that issue, and there's also it reminded me there's this Black Mirror episode. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Be Right Back, where basically the same scenario happened, right? Where a woman loses her husband or boyfriend that we're gonna move in together, and then it's in the future scenario, right?
Mm.
Where they suddenly have
Hmm.
these chatbots and where which takes up all the social media presence, all their text, everything, and she starts chatting with him, and she enjoys it. And then at some point they offer an upgrade, and the upgrade is basically it's a human, a clone, basically, who is supposed to behave like that person, but of course he's a bit more robotic, right? And so in
Yes, right.
the ending is kind of yeah, it's kind of left open if this is good or bad. But yeah, what are your thoughts about, I guess, future possibilities of using technology in order to mourn?
Yeah, I have well, mixed feelings about it. I mean, it seems that if someone really did um, think that the person was replaceable, that is a strange thought, and many people talking philosophically about love, would say, well, one thing that's unique about love is that there's a uniqueness to the person that you love, and the irreplaceability of the person is part of what you have in view. So there's something a little bit strange about the idea of a chatbot clone of a person. And I also think that it would be useful and emotionally and ethically important to keep in mind that the rearrangement that artificial intelligence does of the kinds of things that someone says in order to mimic their style is not the same thing as what the person, him or herself, would have done. And that's important. On the other hand, I can understand, I mean, why you might think, well, this is just something like an enhancement of a photograph. There's a sense in which a photograph, I mean, I think not only captures a person's appearance, but in some ways their orientation toward the world, because you kind of see their way of presenting themselves and sometimes even their active sense of possibilities to a degree. And this might be just carrying it out a little bit further. Um, and I think that people have all kinds of ways of grieving, and this might be valuable for some. But I think that in a future world where everyone thought, well, you know, no big deal, my friend has died, but I'll get a chat bot and we'll be in business soon. That would be a very sad world.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this in our artificial intelligence seminar as well, right? And this, I think one of I forgot who somebody writes about it, but that it could be used in therapy as needed in a
Hmm.
sense, right? And I kind of, and that's of course also controversial, but in a way of to know it's a transitional period and to do it
Hmm.
in that sense, just like yeah, like it's the next stage of technology, just like a photograph or videos that you might look at you can chat with somebody, right? But under a therapeutic kind of context. And yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
sure, but yeah,
I can see that. I mean, there are therapies where, especially when people feel the need to, I mean, I think often people feel the need to say something to the person who's died and are very frustrated because it's going to be a one-way conversation at best. But I think that there are therapies where that people use an empty chair to represent the person, and at least conveying, just saying what someone wants to say to the person can have a kind of cathartic effect. And I don't think that in that context there's any danger of thinking that the chair really is, in some sense, the person. I mean, who knows what people metaphysically believe about these things. I don't know whether a chatbot couldn't do something similar, though presumably it would talk back, and that may or may not be helpful. I mean, I guess one would just, as a therapist, have to be alert to many possibilities of the way this could go, and some of them might not be as helpful as one would hope.
yeah, I agree. How important would you say is the attitude that we have towards the ones that we lost, and then to have an attitude of gratitude? And this is something which you encounter,
Mm.
I've encountered often in this context. So to try to get into yeah the perspective of gratitude towards yeah the deceased.
Well, I think that's very helpful. I mean, I guess I'm always a little bit concerned about cases where there has been a really problematic relationship, and I'm sure that things are made much more complicated in such contexts. Though I'm interested in therapeutic ways that people have utilized aesthetic behaviors to help people come to grips with those kinds of issues. But I think that it is important in some sense to be grateful for what one can. Um, and often, I think, especially in a you know normally good relationship, a sort of non-traumatic relationship, that being appreciative is certainly the best way to proceed. I mean, nobody, I think, reasonably thinks that people you've been close to who have died were perfect people, whatever that would mean. But um, having a sense of the value of the relationship and the value of the person and the connection, what you still um, experience as a consequence of the relationship, I think are very helpful, positive starting points for thinking your way forward.
Yeah, I believe that that makes sense because it also gives us a certain frame and there's something you can actively do in a sense, right? It's something
Yes.
it seems to be an empowering position, which at the same time creates peace.
Hmm. And also, gratitude itself can be motivating, but motivating in a way that maybe isn't compelling in such a way that you feel out of control. So, you know, feeling grateful to someone and deciding to do some kind of memorial thing on their behalf, I don't think it's something that is likely to be frenetically and mindlessly motivating, but can be thoughtfully integrated with other ways you're responding to the loss.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I like that. Okay, I think yes, I'm grateful for our conversation today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. Maybe before we part ways, what is your do you have a next book project? Do you have anything coming up?
Well, it hasn't congealed yet, but I think one of the things I'm interested in is the way that some of these thoughts about grief apply to other kinds of disruptions in life experience. And so thinking through some of the values of aesthetics for disruptions of other sorts is one thing that I'm thinking about. And also the way in which both routine and freshness seem important to people in feeling at home in their lives and at home in the world. Um, I think those are two poles that aesthetic practices often aim to balance, but the nature of that balance and also the idiosyncratic sense of when that balance is really just right are things that I'm thinking about, but it hasn't congealed into a book project yet.
Wow, yeah. Well, I'm definitely interested to hear more about this soon. Uh,
Great.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Kathleen.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.